two fathers killed each other over land neither of them owned. Their bullets met in midair, and both men fell in the same heartbeat, leaving 4 orphan children standing in the dust. The town buried the bodies and raised the children together, enemies' blood mixing at the same table. Some hatreds, we learned, die harder than the men who carry them. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The first thing people remember about Redemption Flats is the cottonwood tree that stands in the town square, its branches spreading wide enough to shade half the street when the sun climbs to its brutal zenith. The second thing they remember is the duel that happened beneath those branches on a September morning in 1878, when 2 men decided that pride was worth more than their children's futures. James Calhoun and Victor Petrov had been neighbors for 7 years, their homesteads separated by a creek that ran silver with snowmelt in spring and dried to cracked mud by August. The dispute started over water rights. It always did in that part of New Mexico territory, where rain was a rumor and every drop meant the difference between harvest and starvation. But somewhere between the first angry words and the final challenge, the conflict transformed into something darker, something that had less to do with water and everything to do with 2 stubborn men who'd forgotten how to bend. The town gathered at dawn, as they always did for duels. Not because they wanted bloodshed. Most folks in Redemption Flats had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, but because witnesses were necessary. Someone had to be able to say what happened, who drew first, whether it was fair. Sheriff Tom Bridger stood at the edge of the square, his weathered face set in lines of resignation. He tried to stop this, spent 3 days riding between the Calhoun and Petrov homesteads, talking himself hoarse trying to broker peace. But some men were beyond reason, beyond compromise. James Calhoun stood at the south end of the square, his back straight despite 43 years of frontier hardship that had bent lesser men. He wore his Sunday suit, the good wool one he'd bought when he married Rebecca, before the fever took her and left him with 2 children to raise alone. His hands were steady as he checked his revolver, a Colt Navy percussion model he'd carried since his cavalry days. Behind him, hidden in the crowd, his children watched. Samuel was 12, old enough to understand what was about to happen, but too young to stop it. Little Margaret was only 8, her hand clutched tight in her brother's, tears already streaming down her face, though the shooting hadn't started. Across the square, Victor Petrov mirrored Calhoun's stance. He was younger by 5 years, broader through the shoulders, with the thick accent of his Ukrainian homeland still coloring his English despite 15 years in America. His revolver was newer, shinier, a Smith & Wesson Russian model he'd won in a poker game in Santa Fe. His children stood with the widow Hernandez, who'd agreed to watch them. Anna was 13, already carrying herself with the dignified sorrow of someone who'd lost her mother too young. Her brother Dmitri was 10, his face pale but his jaw set with the same stubborn pride that had brought his father to this moment. The rules were simple, recited by Sheriff Bridger in a voice that suggested he'd performed this grim ceremony too many times. 20 paces. Turn on his count. Fire when ready. Last man standing wins the water rights dispute, though everyone knew that wasn't really what this was about anymore. They walked their paces. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the violence it knew was coming. James Calhoun counted his steps, his boots leaving prints in the dust that still held the morning's dampness. Victor Petrov did the same, moving with the deliberate precision of a man who'd made peace with his choice. 20 paces. They turned together, movements synchronized by some awful choreography. Their hands moved to their weapons, and in a fraction of a second before they fired, James Calhoun's eyes found his children in the crowd. He saw Samuel's face, saw the boy trying to be brave, saw Margaret crying, and something in his expression shifted. Not enough to stop what came next, but enough that anyone watching closely would have seen the regret already forming. Victor Petrov's gaze found his children too. Anna's face was composed, but her eyes pleaded with him to walk away, to choose life over pride. Dmitri looked terrified and furious in equal measure, caught between love and shame. The shots came together, not one after another, but simultaneously. A single thunderclap of violence that sent ravens exploding from the cottonwood's branches in a panic of black wings. The bullets passed each other in mid-flight, each finding its mark with terrible accuracy. James Calhoun staggered, his hand going to his chest where Victor's bullet had punched through his sternum. Dmitri Petrov spun from the impact, James's shot catching him just below the ribs, angling up toward his heart. They fell together, hitting the dust within a second of each other, their blood beginning to pool and mix in the spaces between them. The crowd surged forward. Dr. Morrison reached James first, his experienced hands already knowing it was hopeless. The man was drowning in his own blood, lungs filling with red foam. Father Miguel knelt beside Victor, whispering prayers in Latin while Victor's eyes glazed over, his breathing coming in wet, rattling gasps. Sheriff Bridger stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and grief. He'd seen men die before, hundreds of them, in the war and in the rough years that followed. But there was something particularly wasteful about this. Two capable men killing each other over a disagreement that could have been solved with conversation and compromise. Samuel Calhoun broke free from the crowd and ran to his father, collapsing beside him in the dust. James tried to speak, his lips moving, but only blood came out. His hand reached for his son's, gripping it with fading strength. His eyes moved past Samuel to where Margaret stood screaming, held back by the widow Hernandez. He tried to mouth words, sorry, maybe, or love you, but death was already pulling him under. Across the space between them, Anna and Dmitri Petrov knelt beside their father. Victor's eyes were still open, still aware, fighting the darkness with the same stubbornness that had brought him to this duel. His hand found Anna's, squeezed it once, then went slack. His final breath was a sigh that sounded almost like relief. In less than 3 minutes, it was over. 2 men dead, 4 children orphaned. A town left to clean up the mess that pride had made. Father Miguel stood slowly, his cassock stained with Victor's blood, and looked at the gathered crowd. His voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that silenced even the weeping. "This," he said, gesturing to the bodies, "is what happens when we forget that we are not enemies, that we are all exiles in this harsh land, and we survive only by caring for each other." The town buried James Calhoun and Victor Petrov the next day, engraved side by side beneath the cottonwood tree. It seemed fitting. They'd lived as neighbors, died as enemies, and would rest as whatever came after both those things. The funerals were attended by everyone in Redemption Flats, and by the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the congregation. But it was what happened after the burial that people would remember. As the last prayers were said and the graves were filled, Sheriff Bridger called a town meeting. The 4 orphan children sat together in the front row of the small church, surrounded by uncertainty about their futures. The meeting lasted 4 hours, voices rising and falling in passionate debate about what should be done with the Calhoun and Petrov children. Redemption Flats was a small town, barely 200 souls scratching out existence on the edge of the New Mexico desert. Resources were scarce, charity was a luxury most couldn't afford, and orphans were a burden that required serious consideration. Widow Hernandez spoke first, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She was a small woman, weathered by 40 years of frontier life, but she commanded respect. "These children have lost everything," she said, her Spanish accented English precise and clear. "Their father's stupidity has left them alone in a world that shows no mercy to the helpless. We have a choice. We can send them to the territorial orphanage in Santa Fe, where they will be separated and likely never see each other again. Or we can honor the memory of their parents by doing what James and Victor failed to do. Choose compassion over conflict." "We can barely feed our own children," someone called from the back. Henry Pritchard, who owned the general store and counted every penny twice. "How are we supposed to take on 4 more mouths?" "Together," Father Miguel interjected, rising from his seat. The Mexican priest had served redemption flats for 12 years, performing baptisms and marriages and far too many funerals. No single family takes all four. We share the burden. We share the blessing. Blessing. Old man Chun, who ran the laundry, shook his head. Those children are the offspring of fools who killed each other over a creek. What blessing is there in that? Sheriff Bridger stood, his bulk and authority commanding immediate silence. The blessing, he said slowly, is the chance to prove we're better than the worst moments of the men we bury. James Calhoun was a good neighbor for 7 years before this dispute. Dmitri Petrov helped build half the homes in this town, never asking for more than fair payment. They made a terrible mistake, and it cost them everything. But their children didn't make that mistake. Their children are innocent. The debate continued, practical concerns mixing with moral arguments. Who would take which children? How would costs be divided? What about the homesteads the men had left behind? The very land they died fighting over. It was Anna Petrov who finally stood, her 13-year-old frame rigid with determination. She'd been silent throughout the meeting, holding her younger brother's hand, her face carefully blank. But now she stepped forward, and something in her bearing made the entire room fall quiet. "My father was wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaking her face. "Mr. Calhoun was wrong. They both let pride kill them, and they left us alone." But her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "But my father also taught me that family is more than blood. He told me stories of his village in Ukraine, where people survived terrible winters by sharing everything. One family's bread, another family's firewood, everyone giving what they could so no one would freeze or starve." She turned to look at Samuel Calhoun, who sat rigid in his seat, trying not to cry. "I don't hate Samuel and Margaret. I don't hate them for what their father did to mine, because my father did the same thing to theirs. They're orphans just like Dmitri and me. We're the same now." Dmitri stood beside his sister, his 10-year-old voice smaller, but no less determined. "If you separate us, if you send us away, then our fathers died for nothing. But if you keep us together, maybe we can be proof that their death meant something, that it taught all of us to be better." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret Calhoun, who hadn't spoken since watching her father die, suddenly stood and walked across the aisle. She stopped in front of Anna and, without a word, threw her arms around the older girl. Anna stiffened for a moment. Then her arms came up to hold the younger child as they both wept. Samuel joined them next, then Dmitri, until all 4 children stood in an embrace that spoke louder than any argument could. The adults in the room watched, and something shifted. You could see it in their faces, the softening of hard lines, the blinking away of tears, the collective realization that children often understood grace better than those who'd lived long enough to forget it. Widow Hernandez stood again. "I will take Anna and Margaret," she declared. "2 girls who can help each other heal. I have room in my home and in my heart." "And I'll take the boys," Sheriff Bridger added, surprising himself as much as anyone else. He'd been a bachelor for 30 years, married only to his badge. But looking at Samuel and Dmitri standing together, he saw an opportunity to do something right in a job usually required him to handle everything that went wrong. "They can help me around the office, learn responsibility, keep each other company." Father Miguel nodded approvingly. "And the homesteads, the land they died fighting over. Combine them," proposed Marcus Webb, who owned the largest ranch in the area. "Work them as one property. Any profit gets split 4 ways and held in trust until the children are of age. That way, the land that divided their fathers can support them instead." The vote was unanimous. The 4 children would stay in redemption flats, raised collectively by a town that had witnessed their tragedy and chosen to transform it into something resembling hope. But good intentions, as everyone would soon learn, were only the beginning of a much harder journey. The first 6 months were the hardest. Samuel and Dmitri moved into Sheriff Bridger's modest house behind the jail, sharing a small room with 2 narrow beds and a single window that looked out on the cottonwood tree where their fathers had died. The boys could see the graves from their window, a constant reminder of what they'd lost and why they were here. At first, they barely spoke to each other. Samuel retreated into silence, performing his chores mechanically, eating when told to eat, sleeping when darkness came. He was his father's right hand on the homestead, learned to work cattle and mend fences and shoot straight. Now all those skills felt useless, tied to a life that had been ripped away. At night, he'd lie awake listening to Dmitri crying quietly into his pillow, and part of him wanted to offer comfort. But a bigger part, the part that kept replaying his father's death, couldn't forgive the boy whose father had pulled the trigger. Dmitri struggled differently. He was angry at his father for dying, at Samuel's father for killing his, at the whole town for forcing them to live together like one big happy family when nothing about this was happy. He'd pick fights at school, throw tools when chores frustrated him, slam doors hard enough to rattle the whole house. Sheriff Bridger weathered it all with patient firmness, neither coddling nor punishing, just providing steady presence. Across town, in the Hernandez home, the girls navigated their own complicated grief. Margaret had nightmares every night, waking screaming that her papa was covered in blood, that he was calling for her, but she couldn't reach him. Anna would climb into bed with her, holding the younger girl until the terror passed, singing Ukrainian lullabies her own mother had once sung to her. During the day, they functioned. Margaret helped widow Hernandez with cooking and mending. Anna took on harder tasks, chopping wood, hauling water, working in the small garden that provided most of their vegetables. They went to school, sat in the small classroom where Miss Patterson taught children ranging from 6 to 16. They did their lessons. They existed, but they didn't heal. Not yet. Healing required something they weren't ready to give: forgiveness. The breaking point came on a cold November evening. Sheriff Bridger had been called away to handle a dispute at one of the outlying ranches, leaving Samuel and Dmitri alone for the night. He'd left them with instructions to heat up the stew on the stove, finish their homework, and stay out of trouble. Instead, the boys fought. It started over something small. Dmitri accidentally knocked over Samuel's slate, cracking it. Samuel snapped, shoving Dmitri into the wall. Dmitri shoved back, years of suppressed fury exploding out of him. "Your father killed mine." Dmitri screamed, his English fracturing under emotional stress, Ukrainian words mixing with English. "He murdered him. Shot him dead. Your father shot first." Samuel shouted back, which wasn't true. The guns had fired together, but grief wasn't interested in accuracy. "Your father started this. The whole water dispute was his fault." They crashed into each other, 12-year-old and 10-year-old, throwing wild punches that mostly missed, grabbing and pushing, and releasing months of pain and violence that felt terrible and necessary at once. They knocked over chairs, sent plates crashing from the table, bloodied each other's noses. And then, exhausted and sobbing, they collapsed together on the floor, all the fight draining out of them. They sat there in the wreckage of their anger, breathing hard, and for the first time, they really looked at each other. "I miss him," Samuel said, his voice broken. "I miss my pa. Even though he was stupid and stubborn and wrong, I miss him so much it feels like I'm dying." "Me too," Dmitri whispered. "Every day I wake up and forget he's gone, and then I remember and it's like losing him again." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. They sat there until Sheriff Bridger came home an hour later, took one look at the destruction and the two boys sitting in the middle of it, and did something unexpected. He sat down on the floor with them. "My son died at Little Bighorn," Bridger said quietly. He was 19, cavalry officer, brave as they come, stupid as they come too. Died in a battle we had no business fighting, in a war that accomplished nothing but graves. He looked at both boys. "For years, I hated the Lakota who killed him. Hated them with everything in me. Then one day I met an old Lakota man whose son had died in that same battle, cut down by cavalry sabers. We looked at each other, and you know what we saw? Two fathers grieving sons. That's it. All the hate in the world couldn't bring them back, couldn't make the loss mean anything." He stood, offering a hand to each boy and pulling them to their feet. Your father's made a terrible choice. But you don't have to make the same one. You can choose to hate each other, or you can choose to survive together. Either way, you're going to be living under this roof. Might as well make it bearable." That night, after they'd cleaned up the mess and eaten cold stew in silence, Samuel did something he'd been avoiding for months. He asked Dmitri about his father. Not about the duel, but about before. What was Dmitri Petrov like? What did he care about? Dmitri answered hesitantly at first, then with growing animation. His father had been a carpenter in Ukraine, built furniture so beautiful that nobles commissioned pieces. He taught Dmitri to see the grain in wood, to work with it instead of against it. He had a laugh that shook his whole body and a singing voice that could make grown men cry. In return, Samuel shared memories of James Calhoun, his father's service in the cavalry during the war, the way he could track anything across any terrain, his terrible jokes that only Margaret had ever laughed at, the pride in his eyes the first time Samuel successfully broke a horse. They talked until late, trading stories like treasures, finding common ground in shared loss. And when they finally slept, for the first time since the duel, neither boy had nightmares. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. By spring, something unexpected had begun growing in Redemption Flats. The 4 children, who'd been forced together by tragedy, were slowly choosing to stay together. It happened in small moments, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely. Samuel started teaching Dmitri to ride properly. The boy had basic skills, but lacked the confidence needed for the frontier. They'd take Sheriff Bridger's horses out to the combined Calhoun-Petrov property, which was being maintained by hired hands until the children came of age. Samuel would demonstrate techniques his father had taught him, patient when Dmitri struggled, encouraging when he succeeded. Dmitri, in turn, taught Samuel woodworking. He'd salvaged tools from his father's workshop and set up a small space in Sheriff Bridger's shed. Under his guidance, Samuel learned to shape wood, to feel how it wanted to bend, to create useful things from raw material. They built a new table for the Hernandez household, each boy contributing skills, working side by side. Anna and Margaret had grown even closer. The 13-year-old had become fiercely protective of the younger girl, and Margaret followed Anna everywhere with the devotion of a little sister. They developed their own language of looks and gestures, could communicate without words. When Margaret still had nightmares, Anna was there. When Anna felt the weight of being responsible for Dmitri and maintaining her father's memory, Margaret would sit quietly beside her, just present, and somehow that helped. The town watched these developments with cautious optimism. Widow Hernandez reported that the girls were thriving as much as could be expected. Sheriff Bridger noted that the boys had stopped destroying his house and started building things together. Father Miguel saw all 4 children at Sunday services, sitting in the same pew, shoulders touching, a united front against a world that had hurt them. But true test came in June, when Robert Calhoun arrived in Redemption Flats. James Calhoun's older brother had been working copper mines in Arizona when word finally reached him about the duel. He rode into town on a Thursday morning, dust-covered and furious, demanding to see his nephews. Sheriff Bridger met him in the street, blocking access to the office where Samuel was doing paperwork. "You're keeping my brother's children in this godforsaken town." Robert's voice carried across the square, drawing attention. "Living with the son of the man who murdered their father?" Bridger's jaw tightened. "Your brother and Dmitri Petrov killed each other, Robert. It wasn't murder. It was mutual stupidity." "I'm taking Samuel and Margaret," Robert declared. "They're blood. They belong with family." "And where were you when they needed family?" Bridger countered. "When your brother was raising them alone after Rebecca died, when they stood watching him bleed out in the street. You were in Arizona, chasing copper. The family these children have now is the one that stayed." Robert pushed past Bridger, entering the office where Samuel had emerged from the back room. Uncle and nephew stared at each other, Samuel seeing a harder, older version of his father's face. Robert seeing a boy who'd grown too fast, aged by grief into something resembling a young man. "Pack your things," Robert said. "You and Margaret. You're coming with me to Arizona. I've got work in the mines, a house. You'll have family." Samuel didn't move. We have family here. The Petrov boy isn't your family. He's the son of your father's killer. He's my brother." The words came out quietly, but with absolute certainty. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters now. The confrontation drew a crowd. Widow Hernandez arrived with both girls, Margaret clinging to Anna's hand. Dmitri stood in the doorway behind Samuel, silent but present. The town gathered, understanding that whatever happened next would define what they'd been trying to build. Robert looked at his niece. "Margaret, honey, don't you want to come with me? I can give you a real home. Get you away from this place where your pa died." Margaret's voice was small but steady. "This is my home. Anna's my sister now. I can't leave her." "Anna can come too, if she wants," Robert offered, grasping for compromise. "And the boy, I'm not heartless. If you need them." "What about the land?" Samuel interrupted. "The property Pa died for. The homestead he built. Sell it. Use the money for your future." "It's not just ours to sell," Samuel said. "It belongs to Dmitri and Anna too. Father Miguel and the town council set it up that way. We share it. All four of us." Robert's face darkened. "Your father would turn in his grave, seeing you give his land to a Petrov." "My father is in his grave because he couldn't see past his own pride." Samuel's voice cracked with emotion. He died hating a man who could have been his friend. "I won't make that mistake. I won't hate Dmitri because our fathers were too stubborn to find peace." Anna stepped forward, still holding Margaret's hand. "Mr. Calhoun, I understand you want to protect your family. But Samuel and Margaret, they saved us too. When my father died, I thought I'd have to raise Dmitri alone, find work, survive however we could. Instead, this town gave us shelter. These people fed us. And Samuel and Margaret, they chose to forgive what our fathers did. They chose us when they could have chosen hate. We're bound together now," Dmitri added, his English much improved from months of practice. "Not by what our fathers did, but by what we choose. We choose each other." The silence that followed was profound. Robert looked at each child in turn, seeing something in their faces that made his anger falter. They stood together, not just physically close, but unified in a way that spoke of months of hard-won trust. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice heavy. "Your father and we didn't always get along. He was stubborn as hell, couldn't admit when he was wrong. I see that in you, Samuel. But I also see something he lost, the ability to choose what's right over what's easy." He looked at Sheriff Bridger. "If I leave them here, you swear you'll look after them? All of them? With my life," Bridger promised. Robert nodded slowly, grief and acceptance warring on his weathered face. "Then I'll respect their choice. But Samuel, Margaret, I'll be in Arizona. If you ever need family, Real blood family, you write to me. You hear?" "Yes, sir," Samuel said. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, he stepped forward and embraced his uncle. Robert's arms came up slowly, holding the boy who was all that remained of his brother. They stood there for a long moment, two pieces of broken family finding brief solace in connection. When Robert rode out of Redemption Flats that afternoon, the four children stood together watching him go. And when he disappeared over the horizon, they turned back to the town that had become their home, bound by something stronger than blood, the conscious choice to build family from the ruins of hate. 10 years passed like water carving stone, slow, patient, inevitable. Samuel and Dmitri became men in the way the frontier demanded. Strong backs, weathered faces, eyes that could read a coming storm or a dishonest man with equal clarity. Anna and Margaret grew into women who understood that strength wasn't just physical, that survival required intelligence and compassion in measures their fathers had never mastered. The combined Calhoun-Petrov homestead had flourished under their shared stewardship. The creek that James and Victor had died fighting over now irrigated fields that fed not just their families, but half of Redemption Flats. The barn they'd built together, Dmitri's carpentry knowledge combined with Samuel's understanding of livestock needs, stood as testimony to what cooperation could achieve when pride stepped aside. But the past never truly releases its grip. It simply waits for the right moment to tighten its fingers around your throat. The trouble arrived on a scorching July afternoon when a rider came into Redemption Flats bearing documents from the Territorial Land Office. The stranger was a lawyer from Santa Fe, all polished words and Eastern education, carrying papers that claimed the water rights to the creek had never been properly filed, that the original claim James Calhoun had made was invalid, that the land was now open to whoever could pay the filing fees and prove continuous use. Standing behind the lawyer were three men Samuel recognized immediately, cousins of Dmitri Petrov, recently arrived from Ukraine with money and ambition burning in their eyes. They'd heard about the prosperous homestead, about the fertile land their cousin had died for, and they'd come to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs by blood. The land belongs to Dmitri Petrov's heirs. The lead cousin, a man named Alexei, declared in heavily accented English, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. We are his family. We have more right than children who share no blood with him. Dmitri stood on the porch of the homestead house, Anna beside him, their faces carefully controlled. Samuel and Margaret approached from the fields, drawn by the sound of voices raised in dispute. The four children, now adults, now landowners, now custodians of a legacy built on tragedy, stood together as they'd learned to do. Sheriff Bridger, now in his 70s, but still carrying his badge, stepped between the groups. This land was deeded to all four of these young people by town decree after the duel. Legal and proper. Whatever claims you think you have, they'll need to go through territorial court. Courts take time, Alexei said, his smile cold. And accidents happen to people who stand in the way of rightful claims. Ukraine taught us that patience is for the weak. Action is for men who want to survive. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. The same violence that had killed their fathers was circling back, wearing different faces, but speaking the same language of greed disguised as justice. That night, the four gathered in the house where they'd grown up, the house they'd built with their own hands from the ruins of two separate homesteads. Samuel sat with his rifle across his knees. Dmitri sharpened his knife with deliberate strokes. Anna checked the loads in her revolver with practiced efficiency, and Margaret stood at the window watching the darkness for movement. We could fight, Samuel said quietly, defend what's ours the way our fathers tried to. And end up like them, Anna replied, her voice sharp, dead in the dust while lawyers and distant relatives divide up what we bled for. Then what? Margaret asked, turning from the window. We just surrender? Let them take everything, because we're afraid of becoming our fathers. Dmitri set down his whetstone, the rasp of metal on stone falling silent. There's a third option. We prove that the land was legally deeded. We go to Santa Fe, present the documentation, force the territorial government to acknowledge what the town decided 10 years ago. We fight them with law instead of bullets. That could take months, Samuel objected. And in the meantime, Alexei and his cousins aren't going to sit idle. They'll sabotage the fields, poison the well, burn the barn. They'll make it impossible for us to maintain the homestead. Then we split up, Anna said, the solution forming even as she spoke. 2 of us go to Santa Fe to handle the legal battle. 2 stay here to protect the homestead. We divide our strengths the way we've always done. They drew lots. Samuel and Anna would travel to Santa Fe. He because of his understanding of the land claims and water rights, she because of her sharp mind for legal maneuvering and her refusal to be intimidated by men in suits. Dmitri and Margaret would remain at the homestead, defending what 4 children had built from the ashes of their father's pride. The next morning, as Samuel and Anna prepared their horses for the journey, Sheriff Bridger appeared with the worn leather satchel. These are all the documents from the duel, the town meeting, the decree that established the combined homestead. Keep them safe. They're your ammunition in the fight ahead. Anna took the satchel with reverence, understanding she was holding more than paper. She was holding the memory of a town that had chosen compassion over hatred, unity over division. As they rode east toward Santa Fe, Samuel looked back once at the homestead. Dmitri stood on the porch, rifle visible, Margaret beside him. They looked small against the vastness of the land, vulnerable in a way that made Samuel's chest tight with fear. But they also looked determined, unbreakable. "We'll win this," Anna said beside him, reading his thoughts. "Not because we're stronger or richer or more ruthless, but because we understand something Alexei and his cousins don't. That land built on blood never holds. That only land built on forgiveness and shared sacrifice can withstand the storms that come." Samuel nodded, turning his horse toward the horizon where Santa Fe waited with its courts and lawyers and the machinery of territorial justice. Behind them, Redemption Flats prepared for another trial, another test of whether the lessons learned from tragedy could survive when faced with greed, wearing the mask of family obligation. The past and present collided on that dusty New Mexico plain. And the future, the real future that 4 orphan children had been building for a decade, hung in the balance, waiting to see if mercy was strong enough to defeat vengeance, if unity could overcome division, if love chosen freely was more powerful than blood claimed by right. The territorial courthouse in Santa Fe stood as a monument to the fragile attempt to bring civilization to the frontier. Stone and timber construction, American flags hanging limply in the still air, men in suits arguing about land and water and money, while the desert waited patiently to reclaim everything they thought they'd conquered. Samuel and Anna spent 6 weeks navigating the bureaucracy, presenting documents, hiring a lawyer who believed in their cause more than his fee, testifying before judges who'd seen 1,000 land disputes and had learned to recognize the difference between legitimate claims and opportunistic theft. The Petrov cousins had money and confidence, but they lacked the one thing that mattered most: proof of continuous occupation and improvement of the land. The combined homestead had records going back 10 years showing irrigation improvements, building construction, crop yields, tax payments. The cousins had only their blood relation to Victor and their insistence that family trumped all other considerations. "Your Honor," Anna stood before the judge, her voice clear and unwavering. "My brother Dmitri carries Victor Petrov's name and his skills as a carpenter. But more than that, he carries the responsibility Victor died before he could fulfill. The responsibility to build something lasting, something that doesn't require violence to maintain. The law recognizes occupation and improvement as the basis of land claims. We have occupied this land. We have improved it. We have transformed it from a source of conflict into a source of prosperity for an entire community." The judge, a man named Whitmore who'd spent 30 years trying to bring order to chaos, listened with eyes that had seen too many families torn apart by disputes over dirt and water. When Anna finished, he looked at the Petrov cousins and asked a simple question. "Did your cousin Victor Petrov ever write to you about this land? Ever invite you to join him? Ever express any desire for his extended family to have claim to what he'd built?" Alexei's silence was answer enough. Judge Whitmore delivered his ruling 3 days later. The land belonged to the 4 individuals who'd occupied and improved it for a decade. The Petrov cousins' claim was denied. Blood relation without contribution meant nothing in the eyes of territorial law. But victory in court didn't mean safety on the ground. Samuel and Anna rode hard for Redemption Flats, the legal documents secured in Anna's satchel, hope and fear warring in their chests. They'd been gone 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which Dmitri and Margaret had been alone, defending the homestead against men who didn't respect legal niceties. They arrived at sunset to find the homestead transformed into a fortress. Dmitri had reinforced the barn, dug defensive positions, stockpiled ammunition. Margaret had organized the neighboring families, all the people who'd benefited from the combined homestead's prosperity over the years, into a network of watchers and defenders. And surrounding the property, camped just beyond rifle range, were Alexei and his cousins, along with a dozen hired guns from the rougher settlements. "They attacked twice," Dmitri explained as they gathered in the fortified house. "First time was 3 weeks ago. We drove them off. Second time was last week. They burned the north field, killed 6 head of cattle. But we held the house and the well. As long as we have water, we can survive." Samuel laid out the court documents, the official seal of the territorial government, visible even in the dim lamplight. It's over. Judge Whitmore ruled in our favor. The land is legally ours. Alexei has no claim. You think men like that care about judges? Margaret asked, her face harder than Samuel remembered, aged by 6 weeks of siege. They came for land, and they'll leave with it or leave dead. Legal documents mean nothing to men who've decided law is just an inconvenience. As if summoned by her words, a shout came from outside. Alexei's voice, amplified by the stillness of the desert evening. Children of Calhoun, children of Petrov, you have until dawn to surrender the property. After that, we burn everything. You can have your court papers and your moral victory. We'll have the land. The four stood together, looking at each other across the table, where they'd shared 10,000 meals, made 10,000 decisions, built a family from the wreckage of 2. We could run, Samuel said quietly. Take what we can carry and start over somewhere else. Live to fight another day. Or we could fight here, Dmitri countered. Make our stand. Prove that what we've built can't be taken by men with guns and no conscience. Anna looked at Margaret, and something passed between them. The understanding of women who'd survived by being stronger than the world expected, smarter than men gave them credit for, more resilient than tragedy should have allowed. There's a third option, Anna said slowly. We talked to them, not to surrender, but to explain what they're really fighting for, to show them what their cousin Victor died trying to defend, and what that death taught us. They won't listen, Samuel objected. Men like Alexei don't care about. Then we make them care, Margaret interrupted. We walk out there unarmed, and we dare them to kill 4 people who've done nothing but try to honor their dead cousin's memory. We make them face what Victor's violence created and what our forgiveness built. It was insane, suicidal, the kind of plan that should have been rejected immediately. But looking around the table at 3 faces he'd known since childhood, Samuel saw something that made him believe. They'd already survived the impossible once, for children left orphaned by their father's duel, raised by a town that chose mercy, building prosperity from land that should have remained cursed. Maybe they could do it again. At dawn, the 4 of them walked out of the fortified house with empty hands raised. Behind them, Sheriff Bridger and 20 armed townspeople watched from defensive positions, ready to respond if Alexei's men opened fire. But they didn't walk out to surrender. They walked out to bear witness. Anna carried the court documents in one hand and a photograph in the other. A picture taken 5 years ago of the 4 of them standing in front of the barn they'd built together. Samuel held a ledger showing 10 years of shared profits, shared losses, shared labor. Dmitri carried a wooden box containing letters their fathers had written before the duel, and ones they'd written to each other over the years. Margaret held nothing but her head high and her voice ready. They stopped 20 feet from Alexei's line, close enough to speak without shouting, close enough to see the surprise and confusion on the men's faces. Your cousin Victor Petrov died on this land, Anna began, her voice carrying across the stillness. He died in a duel with James Calhoun over water, rights neither of them really understood. They killed each other in the same moment, leaving 4 children orphaned. I was 13. My brother Dmitri was 10. Samuel was 12. Margaret was 8. She held up the photograph. This is what we built from that tragedy. Not out of your cousin's memory, but in spite of the violence that killed him. We took land that was cursed by pride and transformed it into something that feeds dozens of families. We took a creek that men died fighting over and turned it into irrigation that waters half this territory. We took the worst day of our lives and used it to create the best years. Alexei's expression hardened. Pretty words, but the land belongs to family. Blood claims. Blood claimed our fathers. Dmitri's voice cut through the morning like a blade. Blood claimed your cousin, and if we'd followed that same path, if we clung to hatred and division and the idea that blood matters more than what you build, we'd all be dead or scattered. There'd be nothing here worth claiming. Samuel stepped forward, opening the ledger. 10 years of records. Every dollar earned, every improvement made, Every decision reached by consensus among four people who had every reason to hate each other and chose partnership instead. You want this land. Then you're also claiming responsibility for what it represents. You're claiming the lesson it teaches. That forgiveness is stronger than vengeance. That mercy builds what violence destroys. Margaret spoke last, her voice quiet but carrying. I still have nightmares about watching my father die. About the sound of the guns, the blood and the dust, the way his hand reached for me, but couldn't quite reach. Dmitri lost his father the same way, in the same moment. We could have spent our lives hating each other, blaming each other, making the land another grave. Instead, we chose to become family, not because blood forced us, but because we decided that the best revenge against death is to live fully, to build beautifully, to transform curse into blessing. The siege line wavered. Several of the hired guns lowered their weapons, uncomfortable with shooting people who stood unarmed speaking truth. Alexei's cousins looked at each other, uncertainty replacing the certainty they'd carried from Ukraine. But Alexei himself remained unmoved. This is all very touching, but sentiment doesn't. A shot rang out, not from Alexei's line, from the town. Sheriff Bridger had fired into the air, the sound echoing across the desert like thunder. That's enough. Bridger's voice carried the weight of 70 years, 40 of them wearing a badge. I've seen one duel destroy 2 families. I won't see another conflict destroy 4 people who've spent a decade proving that there's a better way. Alexei Petrov, you and your men have 1 hour to pack up and leave Redemption Flats. If you're still here after that, I'll deputize every able-bodied person in this town, and we'll drive you out by force. The hired guns began backing away immediately. They'd signed on for intimidation, not for a war against an entire community. Alexei's cousins followed, their resolve broken by the testimony of 4 people who transformed their shared tragedy into shared triumph. Alexei stood alone, his hand still on his pistol, pride and reality warring across his face. Finally, he spoke. Victor was my cousin. I came to honor his memory, to claim what was his. Then honor him by learning from his mistake. Anna replied gently. He died because he couldn't share, couldn't compromise, couldn't see that some things matter more than being right. Don't make the same error. Go home, Alexei. Build something in Ukraine that would make Victor proud, something better than violence and greed dressed up as family duty. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Alexei's hand fell away from his pistol. He looked at the 4 of them, really looked, perhaps for the first time, and saw not obstacles to overcome, but living testaments to a truth he'd been denying. He nodded once, turned, and walked to his horse. His cousins followed. Within an hour, they were gone, riding east toward Santa Fe, and eventually back to whatever life awaited them across the ocean. The 4 stood in the dust, surrounded by townspeople who emerged from defensive positions, cheering and weeping in equal measure. Sheriff Bridger approached, his weathered face creased in a smile. Your fathers would have been proud, he said quietly, not of themselves, but of what you became in spite of them. That evening, as the sun set over the combined homestead, the 4 sat on the porch they'd built together. The field stretched green and prosperous before them. The barn stood solid against the evening sky. The creek ran clear and abundant, dividing and nourishing in equal measure. Do you think they're at peace now? Margaret asked, meaning their fathers. Do you think they know what we built? I hope so, Dmitri replied. I hope somewhere, somehow. They're watching and understanding that their deaths weren't meaningless, that we transformed their worst moment into our best legacy. Samuel raised a cup of water drawn from the creek that had caused so much pain and created so much beauty. To James Calhoun and Victor Petrov, may they rest in peace. And to the 4 of us, may we continue to prove that mercy is the strongest form of justice and forgiveness the most powerful revenge. They drank together as stars emerged overhead, for souls bound not by blood but by choice, standing on land that had learned to yield abundance instead of graves. The duel that changed everything was long over. But its true consequences, the transformation of hatred into love, division into unity, curse into blessing, would echo through redemption flats for generations. And that made all the difference. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.